The evening rush had just begun at the small but elegant restaurant near the center of the city. Warm yellow lights glowed softly from the ceiling, reflecting off polished wooden tables and shining glasses. The place was known for its quiet atmosphere, where wealthy guests often came to enjoy fine food and calm music after a long day. From the outside it looked like a perfect place, peaceful and comfortable. Inside, however, the staff moved quickly from table to table. Plates clinked softly, orders were called into the kitchen, and the smell of freshly cooked meals filled the air. Among the waiters and waitresses moving through the room was a young woman who worked harder than most people noticed. She wore the same simple uniform as everyone else. Her hair was tied back neatly, and her expression was calm and polite. Anyone watching her would see a quiet waitress doing her job like many others. She carried trays carefully, spoke kindly to customers, and never complained when the work became difficult. But behind that quiet smile was a life very few people knew about. Every morning she woke up before the sun. Her small apartment sat above an old building in a crowded neighborhood far from the bright streets of the restaurant district. The room was simple. A narrow bed stood against one wall, and a small table sat near the window. The furniture was old, but it was clean and organized. She never wasted time in the morning. After making a quick breakfast and preparing for the day, she would leave the apartment while the streets were still quiet. The long bus ride to the restaurant gave her time to think about the long day ahead. Work at the restaurant was not easy. Some days customers were kind and friendly, but other days were very different. There were people who treated the staff as if they were invisible. Some snapped their fingers for service, while others complained loudly about small things. Still, she never allowed anger to show on her face. She believed that patience was stronger than pride. Many of the other workers liked her because she was always willing to help. If someone struggled with a heavy tray, she stepped in without hesitation. If a new employee felt nervous, she quietly showed them how things worked. Yet despite spending many hours with her coworkers, she rarely spoke about her past. There was only one thing that sometimes made people curious. At the far corner of the restaurant stood a beautiful black piano. It was placed near a tall window where soft light touched its smooth surface. Most evenings a musician came to play gentle background music for the guests. The music made the restaurant feel calm and elegant. Whenever the waitress passed by that piano, she slowed down for just a moment. It was not something most people noticed. She never touched the instrument or said anything about it. She only glanced at it for a second before continuing her work. But inside her mind, the piano held memories from another time in her life. Years ago, when life was simpler, music had been her greatest joy. She had not grown up in wealth. Her childhood home had been small and often noisy, but there had been warmth inside it. Her mother worked long hours, yet always found time to encourage her children to follow their dreams. One afternoon many years ago, a kind older neighbor heard her humming while playing outside. The woman was a retired music teacher who owned an old piano. After listening for a few minutes, she invited the young girl inside and asked if she wanted to try playing. The first time her fingers touched the piano keys, something magical happened. The sound of the notes felt alive. Even though she had never played before, she understood the rhythm quickly. The teacher noticed the natural feeling she had for music and offered to give lessons whenever she had free time. Those lessons became the happiest moments of her childhood. After school, she would run to the teacher's house and sit at the piano for hours. She practiced simple songs at first, then more difficult ones. Her fingers learned to move smoothly across the keys, and the music slowly grew more beautiful. The teacher often smiled proudly and said that talent like hers was rare. For a while, it seemed possible that music might become her future. But life does not always follow the path people imagine. As the years passed, problems at home began to grow. Money became harder to find. Bills piled up, and responsibilities appeared earlier than expected. Eventually, she had to stop the lessons and focus on helping her family instead. The old teacher understood. On the last day of their lessons, she told the young girl something she would never forget. She said that music does not disappear just because life becomes busy. It waits quietly inside a person, ready to return when the right moment arrives. Those words stayed in her heart for many years. Still, reality was different from dreams. When she grew older, finding steady work became more important than chasing music. The job at the restaurant was not glamorous, but it paid the rent and allowed her to support the people who depended on her. So she learned to focus on responsibility instead of dreams. Yet sometimes, late at night when the restaurant closed and the lights were dimmed, she would walk past the piano one last time before leaving. On rare evenings when no one was around, she allowed her fingers to rest gently on the keys for a few seconds. She never played loudly, just a few quiet notes, soft enough that no one would notice. Those tiny moments reminded her of who she used to be. One evening not long before the night that would change everything, something unusual happened. The regular pianist had arrived late, and the manager looked worried as guests began filling the restaurant. Music was an important part of the atmosphere, and silence made the room feel strange. The waitress watched quietly from a distance while setting tables. For a brief moment she wondered if she should offer to help. The idea appeared in her mind like a small spark of courage. But just as quickly, doubt pushed the thought away. Too many years had passed. She was only a waitress now. The guests would expect a professional musician, not someone who carried plates for a living. So she stayed silent and continued working. A few minutes later the pianist arrived, slightly out of breath but ready to play. The gentle sound of music soon filled the restaurant again, and everything returned to normal. No one noticed the quiet waitress standing near the kitchen door. No one knew the music in her heart. That night ended like many others. Guests finished their meals, the staff cleaned the tables, and the lights slowly dimmed as the restaurant closed. She walked outside into the cool night air and waited for the bus that would take her back home. The city lights glowed in the distance while cars moved quietly through the streets. It looked like any other ordinary night. But sometimes the most ordinary nights are only the beginning of something unexpected. Because very soon, one moment inside that restaurant would change how everyone saw the quiet waitress forever. And it would all begin with one careless comment from a man who believed money gave him the right to laugh at others. The next evening began like any other working day at the restaurant. The sky outside slowly turned orange as the sun moved down behind the tall buildings of the city. Inside the restaurant, warm lights glowed above the tables, making the room feel calm and welcoming. Soft music from the piano drifted gently through the air while guests arrived one by one. The quiet waitress tied her apron and began her shift just as she always did. She checked the glasses, arranged the cutlery, and made sure every table looked perfect before the first guests sat down. Her movements were quick but careful. She had worked here long enough to know exactly how everything should be done. To most people, it looked like just another normal evening. But restaurants can change in a moment depending on the people who walk through the door. The first hour of the evening passed peacefully. Couples spoke softly over dinner. A small family laughed together near the window. The pianist played gentle songs that made the room feel almost dreamlike. The waitress moved quietly between the tables, taking orders and delivering meals. Every now and then a guest thanked her with a friendly smile. Those small moments always made the long hours feel easier. Then the front door opened again. A group of well-dressed guests stepped inside. Their expensive clothes and confident voices made it clear that they were used to luxury. At the center of the group walked a tall man whose presence immediately drew attention. He spoke loudly as he entered, laughing in a way that filled the room. The people with him followed closely, clearly enjoying his company and his jokes. The host welcomed them and led them to one of the largest tables in the restaurant. From across the room, the waitress noticed them right away. Guests like these often meant extra work. They usually ordered many dishes and expected very quick service. Still, she walked toward the table with the same calm expression she showed every customer. "Good evening," she said politely while placing menus on the table. The man at the center barely looked up at first. He continued talking to his friends about business deals and expensive trips as if the staff around him were invisible. When he finally glanced at the waitress, his eyes studied her for a moment. It was not a kind look. It was the type of look someone gives when they believe they are far more important than the person standing in front of them. "Bring us the best food you have," he said casually. And make sure it doesn't take all night. The waitress nodded politely and wrote down the order. She had heard many tones like that before. Some people spoke kindly to staff. Others acted as if politeness was unnecessary. She simply did her job. Soon the table filled with plates of carefully prepared food. The kitchen worked quickly to keep up with the long list of dishes the group had ordered. At first everything seemed normal. The guests laughed loudly and talked about money, travel, and success. Their voices were often louder than the piano music. But as the evening continued, the man's attitude began to stand out more clearly. Each time the waitress returned to the table, he found something to criticize. Once he complained that the water glass was not full enough. Another time he said the food arrived too slowly, even though it had come faster than usual. His friends laughed whenever he made these comments, as if they were part of the entertainment. The waitress stayed calm. She apologized when necessary and quietly corrected whatever small issue he mentioned. Inside, however, she could feel the tension growing. There was something about the way he spoke that felt less like a complaint and more like a performance. It seemed as though he enjoyed making others uncomfortable. Around them, some of the other guests began to notice. A few people exchanged uneasy looks but remained silent. No one wanted to create a scene. The waitress continued doing her best to keep the evening running smoothly. Later, while delivering another tray of drinks, something small happened. As she placed a glass on the table, her elbow lightly touched the edge of a water bottle. A few drops spilled onto the tablecloth. It was a tiny accident, something that could easily be cleaned in seconds. But the man reacted as if something much worse had happened. "Are you serious?" he said loudly, pushing his chair back slightly. His voice cut through the calm atmosphere of the restaurant. Several nearby guests turned their heads. "You can't even pour water properly?" he continued with a laugh that carried across the room. The waitress quickly reached for a napkin and wiped the small spill. "I'm very sorry," she said quietly. But the man was not interested in the apology. "Maybe they should train their staff better," he said to his friends, shaking his head as if the mistake were a great disappointment. His friends chuckled again. The waitress felt the familiar warmth of embarrassment rise in her face, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had learned long ago that reacting emotionally only made situations like this worse. She finished cleaning the table and stepped back politely. "Is there anything else I can bring you?" she asked. The man leaned back in his chair, thinking for a moment. Then his eyes slowly moved toward the corner of the restaurant where the piano stood. A slow smile appeared on his face. "Actually," he said, his voice now filled with playful mockery, "maybe you can entertain us." The waitress looked confused for a second. "Entertain you?" she repeated softly. The man pointed toward the piano. "That thing over there," he said. "You work in such a fancy place. Surely you can do more than carry plates. Why don't you play something for us?" His friends burst into laughter at the idea. Some nearby guests looked uncomfortable, sensing that the moment was turning cruel. The waitress felt her heart beat faster. For a moment she thought she had heard him wrong. But the man continued speaking, clearly enjoying the attention. "Come on," he said loudly enough for several tables to hear. "Give us a show." The room grew strangely quiet. Even the piano music in the background seemed softer as the pianist slowed his playing, unsure of what was happening. The waitress stood still, unsure how to respond. He could not possibly know about her past with music. To him, this was simply another joke. But for her, the piano was not a joke at all. It was a piece of her life she had carefully hidden for years. She forced a small polite smile and shook her head gently. "I'm sorry," she said. "I need to continue working." The man raised his eyebrows dramatically. "Oh, so you can't play?" he said with a teasing tone. His friends leaned forward, curious to see what would happen next. "That's what I thought," he added with a smirk. A few people at nearby tables shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The waitress lowered her eyes for a moment, trying to ignore the laughter coming from the table. She turned slightly, planning to walk away and return to her work. But the man spoke again before she could leave. "Wait," he said, his voice suddenly louder. The room fell even quieter. "If you really want to make up for that little mistake," he continued while pointing toward the piano again, "prove us wrong. Go ahead and play something." His friends laughed once more, expecting nothing more than another moment of embarrassment. The waitress felt frozen in place. Across the room, the black piano sat quietly under the soft lights. For years it had only been a silent reminder of a dream she believed was gone. Now every eye in the restaurant seemed to be watching her. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing on her shoulders. And deep inside her mind, memories she had tried to forget were beginning to return. For several long seconds the waitress did not move. The restaurant that had been full of quiet conversations only minutes earlier now felt strangely silent. Many guests had stopped eating. Some pretended to continue their meals, but their attention was clearly focused on the scene near the large table. The man leaned back in his chair with a confident smile, clearly pleased with the attention he had created. His friends watched the waitress with amused expressions, waiting for her reaction. To them, this was simply another moment of entertainment during their expensive dinner. But for the waitress, the moment felt very different. Her heart was beating faster than usual. She could hear it clearly in her chest. The words the man had just spoken seemed to echo in her mind. Go ahead and play something. To everyone else in the room, it was only a careless joke. But to her, it felt like someone had suddenly opened a door she had kept closed for many years. She glanced again toward the corner of the restaurant where the piano stood under the soft lights. The black surface reflected the warm glow from the ceiling lamps. The pianist who had been playing earlier had now stopped completely. He sat quietly on the bench, watching the situation with a confused expression. The waitress lowered her eyes for a moment, trying to collect her thoughts. Part of her wanted to walk away immediately. She could return to the kitchen, continue serving other tables, and pretend none of this had happened. That would be the easiest choice. But another feeling slowly appeared inside her. It was a memory. She remembered sitting at an old piano many years ago, while the retired teacher patiently guided her hands across the keys. She remembered the joy of learning a new melody, and the pride she felt each time she played a difficult piece correctly. Those memories had been quiet for a long time, hidden under years of responsibility and hard work. Now they were suddenly very close again. What happened? The man said loudly, interrupting her thoughts. Did the cat get your tongue? His friends laughed again. A few guests at nearby tables exchanged uncomfortable looks. One older couple near the window shook their heads slightly, clearly not enjoying the situation. The waitress finally looked up. Her voice was calm but soft. I really should continue working, she said politely. The man waved his hand dismissively. Relax, he replied. We're just asking for a little music. This place is supposed to be fancy, right? One of his friends added with a grin. Maybe she actually can play. That would be something, another one said sarcastically. The group laughed again. The waitress could feel the attention of the entire restaurant pressing on her. She had experienced rude customers before, but this moment felt different because of the piano. The piano meant something personal. The restaurant manager noticed the scene from across the room. He walked a few steps closer, clearly unsure whether he should interrupt. Situations involving wealthy guests were always delicate. Creating a confrontation could cause bigger problems. For a moment the manager simply watched, waiting to see what the waitress would do. The waitress took a slow breath. She thought about all the years she had spent hiding her love for music. She thought about the words her old teacher had once told her, that music never truly disappears. Maybe the teacher had been right. Still, doubt quickly followed that thought. So much time had passed since she had played seriously. What if she made mistakes? What if her hands trembled? What if the man and his friends laughed even louder? Her fingers tightened slightly around the small notepad she was still holding. Across the room the piano remained silent, waiting. Come on, the man said again, clearly enjoying the attention. You don't have to be shy, just press a few keys. His tone made it clear that he expected nothing impressive. In his mind this would only make the joke funnier. The waitress slowly placed her notepad into the pocket of her apron. That simple movement caught the attention of several guests. The pianist near the instrument also noticed. He quietly stood up from the bench and stepped aside, curious about what might happen next. The waitress looked once more at the man who had challenged her. His expression was relaxed and confident, as if he already knew the outcome of the situation. Then she looked toward the piano again. The distance between her and the instrument was not far. Only a few tables separated them. Yet it felt like a much longer journey. She hesitated. Every step toward that piano would mean revealing a part of herself she had kept hidden for years. But something inside her had already made a quiet decision. Without saying another word, she began walking. The movement surprised many people in the room. Some guests leaned forward slightly in their chairs. Others stopped eating completely. Even the kitchen staff near the door paused their work to watch. The waitress walked slowly but steadily across the restaurant floor. The soft sound of her shoes against the wooden floor was almost the only noise in the room. The group at the large table watched with growing interest. "Well, look at that," one of the man's friends said quietly. "She's actually doing it." The man chuckled. "This should be good," he replied. The waitress reached the piano and stopped beside it. For a moment she simply stood there. The instrument looked exactly the same as it did every night, but standing so close to it felt strangely emotional. The smooth surface of the piano reflected her image faintly. She slowly placed her hand on the edge of the instrument. The familiar feeling of the polished wood under her fingers brought back another wave of memories. She remembered practicing late into the evening years ago while the old teacher listened carefully. She remembered the small nod of approval whenever she played a difficult passage correctly. Her chest tightened slightly with emotion. The pianist who had been playing earlier stood nearby, watching respectfully. He seemed to understand that this moment meant something important. "Take your time," he whispered quietly so that only she could hear. The waitress nodded slightly. Then she gently sat down on the piano bench. A soft murmur moved through the restaurant. Even the man who had started the challenge seemed a little surprised that she had gone this far. The waitress placed her hands slowly above the keys. For a moment she did not press anything. She simply looked at the keyboard in front of her. White and black keys stretched across the instrument like a path she had once known very well. Her fingers hovered slightly above them, unsure at first. She took another slow breath. The room waited. Every guest, every staff member, even the man who had mocked her earlier was watching closely. The waitress closed her eyes for just a second. Inside her mind she heard the voice of her old teacher again, gentle and encouraging. Music waits patiently, ready to return when the moment is right. When she opened her eyes again, something inside her felt calmer. Her fingers slowly lowered toward the keys. The man at the table leaned forward slightly, expecting an awkward attempt that would make his friends laugh. But the waitress was no longer looking at him. Her attention was completely focused on the piano in front of her. For the first time in many years, she allowed herself to trust the music that had always lived quietly inside her. Her fingers touched the keys, and the very first note was about to fill the silent restaurant. For a brief moment after her fingers touched the keys, nothing happened. The waitress sat quietly at the piano, her hands resting gently in place as if she were listening to something only she could hear. The restaurant remained silent. Plates sat untouched on tables, and conversations had completely faded away. Many of the guests expected the moment to turn awkward. Some thought she might press a few random notes and then quickly stop. Others believed she would become too nervous and stand up again. The group at the large table, especially the man who had challenged her, waited with amused expressions. But the waitress was no longer thinking about them. Her focus was entirely on the piano. She took one slow breath, allowing the noise of the room to disappear from her mind. The nervous feeling in her chest slowly faded as something more familiar began to take its place. It was the feeling she used to have years ago when she sat at the old piano during her lessons. Her fingers moved. The first note sounded softly in the room. It was clear, gentle, and perfectly controlled. A second note followed, then another. Within seconds, the simple sounds began to form a quiet melody that floated through the restaurant like a calm breeze. Several guests blinked in surprise. This was not the clumsy playing they had expected. The waitress kept her eyes on the keyboard, her hands moving slowly at first as if greeting an old friend after a long time apart. Each note seemed careful and thoughtful, like a memory being brought back to life. The pianist who had stepped aside earlier watched closely. His expression slowly changed from curiosity to quiet admiration. He could immediately tell that the person sitting at the piano understood music. The melody grew slightly stronger. What began as soft notes slowly turned into a flowing piece of music that moved across the restaurant. The sound filled the room in a way that felt warm and emotional. One couple sitting near the window stopped eating completely. The woman placed her fork down gently and leaned forward to listen. At another table, a group of guests turned their chairs slightly toward the piano. Even the kitchen door opened quietly as one of the cooks peeked outside, wondering what had caused the sudden silence. The waitress continued playing. As the music grew, her confidence returned more clearly with every passing moment. Her fingers moved faster now, gliding smoothly across the keys with natural control. The melody changed, rising and falling like a story being told without words. There was something deeply emotional in the way she played. The music did not sound like someone trying to impress an audience. Instead, it felt honest, as if every note carried a piece of her life. Years of quiet memories seemed to pour into the sound. The guests felt it. Some people closed their eyes for a moment while listening. Others watched her hands move across the keyboard with amazement. The man who had started the whole situation slowly stopped smiling. At first he leaned back in his chair, still expecting the performance to end quickly. But after a minute passed, his expression began to change. He sat forward slightly. The laughter from his table disappeared. His friends looked at one another in surprise, unsure of what to say. The joke they had been enjoying was no longer funny. The waitress was not embarrassing herself. She was performing, and she was performing beautifully. The music continued to grow richer and more powerful. Her hands moved across the keys with confidence that surprised even herself. The long years without practice seemed to fade away as if they had never existed. It was as if the music had been waiting patiently inside her all this time. The restaurant now felt like a small concert hall. No one spoke. Even the soft sounds of glasses and plates had stopped completely. Every person in the room was focused on the piano. The manager stood near the counter watching with wide eyes. He had worked in the restaurant for many years, yet he had never seen anything like this happen during dinner service. The pianist who had given up the bench earlier leaned quietly against the wall with a respectful smile. He understood something important in that moment. This was not just a waitress pressing keys. This was someone who truly loved music. The melody shifted again. Now the notes moved faster, weaving together in a lively rhythm that filled the room with energy. The sound echoed softly against the walls and ceiling, making the restaurant feel larger than it really was. Several guests exchanged amazed looks. A young man at one table quietly took out his phone, not to distract the moment but to remember it. The man who had mocked her earlier now sat completely still. His confident attitude had disappeared. Instead of laughing, he stared at the piano with a serious expression. It was clear that he had not expected this outcome at all. The waitress did not look at him. She was lost in the music. Her shoulders relaxed as her fingers continued dancing across the keyboard. Each movement felt natural, guided by years of practice that had once filled her childhood days. For the first time in a very long time, she felt free. The music slowly began to soften again. After the lively section, the melody returned to something gentle and emotional. The notes drifted through the room like quiet reflections at the end of a long story. Many guests felt a strange warmth in their hearts while listening. Some did not even realize they had been holding their breath. The waitress allowed the final notes to slow down carefully. Her fingers pressed the last few keys with delicate control, letting the sound fade naturally into the quiet air. Then the music stopped. Her hands remained on the keyboard for a moment longer. The restaurant stayed completely silent. No one moved. It was the kind of silence that happens when people are deeply touched but do not yet know how to react. The waitress slowly lifted her hands from the keys. She looked down at them for a second, almost surprised by what had just happened. Only a few minutes earlier she had been standing beside a table, apologizing for a small mistake. Now the entire room was staring at her. For several long seconds nothing changed. Then, from somewhere near the back of the restaurant, a single pair of hands began to clap. The sound was soft at first but clear in the quiet room. Another guest joined in. Then another. Within moments the silence broke into a wave of applause that filled the entire restaurant. People stood from their chairs. Some smiled widely, others shook their heads in disbelief. The sound of clapping grew louder and louder. The waitress looked around slowly, her eyes filled with quiet surprise. She had not expected this reaction at all. Across the room, the man who had mocked her earlier remained seated, watching her with an expression that had completely changed. For the first time that evening, he had nothing to say. And in that moment, everyone in the restaurant understood something clearly. The quiet waitress they had barely noticed before was far more remarkable than anyone had imagined. The sound of applause continued to fill the restaurant for several long moments. It was not the polite clapping people sometimes give after a short performance. This applause felt real and full of emotion. Guests were smiling, some were even standing, and many people looked at the waitress with amazement. She remained seated at the piano for a moment, unsure of what to do next. Her hands rested quietly in her lap now, and her heart was still beating fast from the unexpected performance. Just minutes earlier she had been carrying plates between tables like any normal evening. Now the entire room was looking at her in a completely different way. Slowly she stood up from the piano bench. The applause continued. A few guests nodded at her with warm expressions as if they were thanking her for the music. One elderly man near the window even placed his hand over his heart while clapping, clearly touched by what he had just heard. The waitress felt a little overwhelmed. She was not used to this kind of attention. For years she had worked quietly in the background, rarely noticed by anyone except when something went wrong. Now it felt as if everyone in the room suddenly saw her for the first time. She gave a small, shy smile and lowered her head slightly in appreciation before stepping away from the piano. As she began walking back toward the center of the restaurant, the applause slowly faded into quiet conversations. People began talking excitedly about what they had just witnessed. "I had no idea she could play like that," one guest whispered to another. "That was incredible," someone else said from a nearby table. Even the kitchen staff who had gathered near the door looked impressed. The pianist who usually played during dinner service walked over to her with a friendly smile. "That was beautiful," he said sincerely. "You play with real feeling." The waitress felt slightly embarrassed by the compliment and thanked him quietly. But the moment was not completely finished yet. Across the restaurant, the large table where the wealthy group sat had grown unusually quiet. The man who had started the whole situation was no longer leaning back confidently in his chair. Instead he sat still, his eyes following the waitress as she walked away from the piano. His friends looked different as well. The laughter that had filled their table earlier was gone. For a while none of them spoke. Finally one of them cleared his throat and said quietly, "Well, I guess that didn't go the way we expected." Another friend nodded slowly. "Not at all," he replied. The man who had mocked the waitress earlier remained silent. Something about the performance had clearly affected him more than he expected. The confident smile he had worn earlier had disappeared completely. The waitress returned to the center of the room and paused for a moment, unsure if she should continue working as if nothing had happened. The restaurant manager approached her quickly. He looked both surprised and impressed. "Why didn't you ever tell me you could play like that?" he asked softly. The waitress shrugged slightly. "It has been a long time," she replied. "And this is my job now." The manager looked back toward the piano and then at the guests who were still talking about the performance. "Well," he said with a small smile, "you just made tonight very special for everyone here." She nodded politely, still unsure how to respond to all the attention. Just as she was about to return to her regular duties, a chair moved loudly across the floor. The sound came from the large table. The man who had mocked her earlier slowly stood up. The movement immediately caught the attention of several guests nearby. The waitress noticed him as well. For a moment she felt a small wave of nervousness again, unsure of what he might say next. The man walked toward her. His steps were slower now, and the confident energy he had earlier seemed to be gone. The room grew quieter again as people watched. When he reached her, he stopped a short distance away. For a second he looked as if he was searching for the right words. Then he spoke. "I didn't expect that," he admitted honestly. The waitress remained calm and simply listened. "Earlier," he continued, "I thought I was just making a joke." He paused briefly and glanced toward the piano. "But that wasn't a joke," he added. The waitress did not respond immediately. She had experienced rude customers before, and she had learned not to expect much from moments like this. But the man surprised her. "I owe you an apology," he said. The words were simple, but the tone in his voice sounded sincere. Several guests nearby watched closely, curious about what would happen next. "I shouldn't have spoken to you that way," he continued. "You were just doing your job." The waitress looked at him quietly for a moment. Then she gave a small nod. "Thank you," she said politely. The moment felt honest and calm. The man seemed slightly relieved after saying the words, as if admitting his mistake had lifted something from his shoulders. Behind him, his friends watched with surprised expressions. None of them had expected the evening to end like this. After a moment, the man added something else. "You really are talented," he said. "You shouldn't hide that." The waitress smiled softly but did not answer right away. For many years she had believed that part of her life was finished. But tonight had reminded her that music had never truly disappeared. Around them, the restaurant slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Guests continued their meals, and quiet conversations filled the air once again. Yet the atmosphere felt slightly different now. There was a new respect in the way people looked at the waitress when she walked past their tables. Some guests even thanked her personally for the music. A young couple near the window asked if she would ever play again sometime. She simply smiled and said she was not sure. But deep inside, something had already begun to change. The piano in the corner no longer looked like a reminder of a forgotten dream. Now it looked like a door that might open again. And although the evening was not finished yet, one thing had already become clear. The quiet waitress who had once been mocked had just shown everyone in the room a side of herself that no one would forget. The restaurant slowly returned to its usual rhythm after the applause faded. Guests continued their meals, waiters carried plates from the kitchen, and quiet conversations filled the room again. Yet something about the atmosphere had changed. People were still talking about the unexpected performance, and many eyes followed the waitress with a new kind of respect whenever she walked past. For her, the evening felt different too. She moved between the tables just like before, refilling glasses and clearing plates, but inside her mind the sound of the piano was still echoing. Her fingers almost felt warm, as if they still remembered every key she had touched only minutes earlier. For many years she had believed that part of her life was finished. Music had become only a memory she carried quietly in her heart while focusing on work and responsibility. But tonight something had awakened again. She tried not to think about it too much as she continued working. The restaurant was still busy, and there were many guests who needed service. At one table, a couple thanked her kindly and told her the music had made their evening special. At another table, someone asked if she played professionally. Each time she answered politely and moved on, still a little shy about the attention. Meanwhile, the wealthy group finished their meal more quietly than before. The man who had mocked her earlier seemed thoughtful. He spoke less than he had at the beginning of the evening. From time to time he glanced toward the piano as if replaying the moment in his mind. Eventually the group stood up to leave. As they prepared to walk out of the restaurant, the man paused near the entrance. He looked once more toward the waitress, who was placing clean glasses on a nearby table. For a moment it seemed as if he wanted to say something else. But instead he simply gave a small respectful nod before turning and leaving with his friends. The door closed behind them, and the night continued. Hours later, the restaurant finally became quiet again. The last guests paid their bills and stepped out into the cool evening air. One by one, the lights above the dining area were dimmed while the staff began cleaning the tables. The waitress helped wipe the counters and stack the chairs just as she did every night. But her coworkers were still curious about what had happened earlier. "I can't believe you never told us you could play like that," one of the servers said while folding napkins. Another worker nodded. "You should be on a stage somewhere, not carrying trays with us." The waitress laughed softly and shook her head. "Life doesn't always work that way," she replied. The restaurant manager walked over and joined the conversation. "Still," he said thoughtfully, "tonight reminded me that people can surprise us when we least expect it." After the cleaning was finished, the staff prepared to leave for the night. The waitress picked up her bag and walked toward the door. Just before stepping outside, she glanced back at the corner of the restaurant where the piano stood quietly under the dim lights. The instrument looked calm and ordinary again. Yet now it felt different to her. She walked over slowly. The restaurant was empty except for the manager near the counter finishing paperwork. The quiet room allowed every small sound to echo softly. She stood beside the piano for a moment, remembering how nervous she had felt when everyone in the room was watching earlier. Then she gently placed her hand on the smooth surface. "You played beautifully tonight," the manager said from across the room. She turned slightly and smiled. "Thank you," she replied. He looked at her with curiosity. "Have you ever thought about playing again? I mean, seriously." She hesitated before answering. "I used to dream about it," she said slowly. "But life changed." The manager nodded with understanding. "Life always changes," he said. "But sometimes it gives second chances when we don't expect them." His words stayed in her mind as she left the restaurant and stepped out into the cool night air. The city looked peaceful at that hour. Streetlights reflected softly on the pavement, and only a few cars moved through the quiet roads. She walked toward the bus stop like she had done hundreds of times before. But tonight her thoughts were different. She kept remembering the faces of the guests while she was playing. The way the room had gone silent. The way the music had returned so naturally after all those years. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to imagine something she had not thought about in years. What if music could still be part of her future? The idea felt both exciting and frightening. She knew life would not magically become easy. She still had responsibilities and bills to pay. The restaurant job was still important. But the evening had reminded her of something powerful. Dreams do not always disappear just because time passes. Sometimes they simply wait. The bus arrived, and she climbed aboard, taking a seat near the window. As the city lights moved slowly past outside, she closed her eyes for a moment. In her mind, she could hear the melody she had played earlier. The notes felt alive again. Back at the restaurant, the manager finished locking the doors and turned off the final lights. Before leaving, he paused for a moment beside the piano. He smiled slightly, remembering the surprised expressions of the guests earlier that evening. "You never know," he murmured quietly to himself, "who might be hiding a remarkable story." The next evening, the restaurant opened again like any other day. Guests arrived, orders were taken, and the sound of music once again filled the room. But something small had changed. When the waitress walked past the piano this time, she did not only glance at it quickly before continuing her work. Instead, she paused for just a second longer. Not because of sadness or regret, but because now she knew the music inside her had never truly been gone. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet hope had begun to grow again. Sometimes life moves in unexpected directions. A careless joke can turn into a moment that changes how people see each other. A hidden talent can appear when no one expects it. And a dream that seemed lost can quietly return when the right moment arrives. That night in the restaurant had started with laughter at someone else's expense. But it ended with something far more meaningful. It reminded everyone in the room that respect matters, that talent can appear in the most ordinary places, and that no one should ever be judged only by the job they do. As for the quiet waitress, her story was not finished. In fact, in many ways, it was only just beginning.